Good afternoon. My name is Pam Lanhart, and I'm the director of Thrive Family Support. Thrive is a family support network based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I'm honored to be one of the keynote speakers for this very first Family Recovery Conference. I just really want to honor and acknowledge Shelley Young for her vision for putting together this conference and her passion for family recovery, which is really what connected us. I have just a desire to help families heal because I have seen how healing has happened in our own family by making small changes, by one person starting that process of change, and how that ripples into the whole rest of the family. I've titled my talk Empowering Whole Family Healing, and we're going to talk about 4 core beliefs and some actionable solutions that we can implement in our own family that can help facilitate healing in our family. And I share these not as an expert that's been educated on the disease of addiction, but coming from the place of this is what worked for us. It's been a journey, it's been a lot of mistakes, it's been a lot of trial and error, and it's really been born out of a very non-traditional pathway to recovery. But before I get into talking about that, I really wanted to give you some insight on how I got here and my journey and our family's journey. My journey actually started when I was born. I was born into a family that had been impacted generationally by addiction. My dad struggled and suffered with the disease of alcoholism his whole life. And at the age of 51, he passed away as collateral damage from the disease. I was only 28 years old at the time, and I did know enough about addiction to know that there was a generational component to that. So I set out when I had my own kids to parent in a way that would break that generational pattern. I checked off all of the parenting boxes. My husband and I have been married for 38 years. We incorporated all of the things that the experts tell you that we should do as parents. So we had family meals together. We played games on Friday night together. We went camping together as a family. We did a lot of fun family vacations. We also had our kids involved in healthy activities, and they played sports. They went to church on a regular basis. We monitored their friend groups. We made sure that they took care of their school academics. We were involved, but I would like to think that we weren't overly involved, and we really tried hard to balance love and discipline. And it wasn't enough. When our son was 13, we got a call from his junior high that he had a backpack full of pills that he had brought to school. And we had been having some difficulties with him, and we had some concerns, but that was really the first event that rocked us to the core. Over the next couple years, our family became very toxic, very chaotic. We knew that there was an elephant in the room, and that elephant was that our son had a problem, that he had a use disorder. So at 15, we packed his little suitcase and brought him to his first rehab, which was a top shelf, nationally renowned program that worked with adolescents who were suffering from substance use disorder. We once again followed the plan. We checked off all the boxes. We did everything that we possibly could to support him in his addiction and him in his recovery. 3 months later, he had relapsed. We put him in the same treatment center, and 5 days after that, he disappeared and went off the grid for about another 5 days. You see, he had learned very quickly how to work the system, and that by law, he did not have to stay in that treatment program. There was nothing we could do to forcibly keep him there. But there was also nothing we could do to keep him from coming back into our home. The laws in our state were such that we were mandated to have our son in our home, even if he was creating difficulties for our family. And honestly, we wouldn't have made a different choice. We believed that he was meant to be our child, and we believed that we were meant to be his parents, and we really valued relationship. But at that time, we were completely at the end of ourselves. We were broken. And I remember days on end sitting in this chair right here. This is my healing chair. Sitting in this chair, absolutely at the end of myself, absolutely broken. With no answers, with no solutions. Everyone that we looked to for advice said, we're not really sure what you should do. You know, we got some good advice from really educated people that told us, well, you just have to let go. You just have to disconnect. You have to detach. And that wasn't a good enough answer for us because we had a 15-year-old boy that we were afraid we were going to lose if something didn't change in our family. And then we had the other end of the spectrum, which again were well-meaning people who shared with us that it was a sin issue. And that if we just clamped down on our son and we parented our son differently, that things would be okay in our family, that he would grow out of this. And with an ambivalent, even oppositional child, that made things even worse. And I remember times when we literally locked him in our house or held him down or pulled drugs out of his hand. And our home was so chaotic. And we would call the police and the police wouldn't know what to do. And I remember one day during this most difficult time sitting with a trusted pastor, and he looked at us in all of our chaos and all of our agony and all of our pain. And he said, do you want to be right for the sake of justice, or do you want to love for the sake of relationship? Because love never fails. Let me repeat that. He said, do you want to be right for the sake of justice, or do you want to love for the sake of relationship? Because love never fails. That struck my heart, and I asked myself a question that day. And that question was, if my son got sober, would he even want to have a relationship with me? Was I loving him well? Was I loving him in a way that would restore our family? That would facilitate connection, not disconnection? That would help him to feel loved and valued? And in that, I could not answer yes at that time. So we embarked on a journey over the next 5 years to figure it out. And through just some miraculous interventions, we were able to facilitate some healing in our family. And not just with our son, but with our other children, because they had been affected by this. They had been wounded by this. And we were able to keep our marriage intact through this. And most importantly, we're walking in peace and we're walking in freedom. One of the pivotal things that happened was 3 years ago, I went to our state certified peer recovery training program. And I really began to understand the disease of addiction as a medical issue, that required medical treatment and medical interventions. I began to understand languaging in the disease. And I began to understand this concept of peer support and peer coaching. And most importantly, I understood the idea of various recovery modalities. And as I started to learn about supporting all different treatment modalities and all different recovery modalities, I really realized that that was what was going on in my own family. We did not find our recovery through the traditional pathway of family recovery. And yet our family is in recovery, and it is being healed as a result of the journey that we've been on. And as I started reflecting on that, I began writing about it. And the things that I wrote really resonated with people. People were like, oh my gosh, yes, loving well. We have 20 topics in our support groups. And I really have coined this phrase, from tough love to loving well. Because, and I know love is tough. I know it's hard. But we could not use the traditional tough love pathway in our family. And so what's worked for us is something that's been rooted in love, and I call it loving well. And all 20 of the topics that we do in our support groups really come out of these 4 core beliefs that I'm going to share with you right now. So with that, I'm going to begin. And we're going to start with core principle number 1, which is the power of intrinsic human value. One of the things that we realized through the process of addiction was that our home had become a war zone. And the reason that our home was a war zone was because we had dehumanized our son in the process of seeing him as his disease. When he came out of that first treatment program, he was told that he was an addict. And we were told that our son was an addict. And at 15, that, what I feel is a damaging label, was put on our son. And we had seen pictures of addiction. We had watched TV and seen how they portray addicts. And I think that we began to see our son that way. And fear drove us because we heard about addicts dying, and we saw pictures of the disease and the devastation of the disease. And we operated out of this belief that our son was really his disease. And as we've journeyed through this process, we came to this realization that there is no other disease where someone is labeled by their disease. If you have cancer, you don't say, I'm cancer. Or if you have diabetes, you don't say, I'm diabetes. But yet in the disease of addiction, we say, I'm an addict. And because of the vision we had of addiction, and because of the shame that goes with that label, it drove us to devalue our son and treat him differently. And it was really through working with the homeless population that I started to think about intrinsic value and change just my general view of people. First of all, I began to understand that my son was not his disease. And I began to operate out of the assumption that my son had intrinsic value whether or not he ever got sober. I work with the chronically mentally ill and the homeless on a regular basis, and many of them will never, ever have the life that society thinks that we should have. And yet when I go down there every single week, I see people just like you, just like me, and I see value. And those people have taught me more about myself and more about life and more about love than most of the people I sit in the pews of church with every single week. And one of the things that has healed me is really understanding this concept of human value. That my son deserves to be loved and valued regardless of whatever happens to him, and regardless of whether or not he ever gets sober. And when I got to that place, I was able to let go of all of my expectations of him. You see, society puts all these expectations on our kids. And when I was able to let go of that, I was able to just love him radically. And I think that really freed us. The second piece of this is understanding my identity. Some people will talk about self-love, and I think that really is where that comes from, is understanding that we are valued human beings regardless of outcomes. And this was a really big life lesson for me, because through this journey and dealing with addiction in my own family of origin, I became an overachiever. I became a control freak and a people pleaser all at the same time. But a lot of my value came in outcomes. I was very successful at most things that I did. And by the time I had my second child, I gave up a 6-figure career to do my mommy job. And I wanted to do it well. And so I put everything into that. And my only job in life was to be a good wife and a good mother. And my first 2 kids kind of followed the plan. And my third and fourth, not so much so. And because I put so much value in outcomes, I started to feel like I was failing. I put that on myself. And because I felt like I was failing, I also went into the mode that I could fix it somehow. Trying to fix things that aren't necessarily always broken leads to codependency. Or it might even lead to things becoming even more broken. Now I know that those things weren't mine to fix in the first place. And so that took some really deep spiritual seeking to understand that I am loved and that I am valued and that my value doesn't come from outcomes. It doesn't come from achievement. It doesn't come from whether my son ever gets sober or not. And if there is one thing you walk away from after this talk, I hope you hear me when I say to you, you are enough. You are more than enough. And if we operate out of that place that we are enough, we heal and we're set free. And what that did for me is it helped me step out of the cycle of war into developing a heart of peace in my family, because I was no longer driven by the need to fix, and I was no longer driven by outcomes. I was no longer driven by the need for my son to get sober. We wanted to provide an environment that would facilitate sobriety and recovery. But I was going to love my son regardless of whether that ever happened or not. second core value is the power of empathy. Now, I love Brene Brown, and I love how she explains what empathy is. And I love the fact that she talks a lot about the role of shame. And one of the things that I've discovered through this process is that shame drives disconnection and empathy drives connection. And if the opposite of addiction is connection, then it would stand to reason that bringing empathy into our family can reform those connections. And this is really, really powerful. And I think there's two things that we have to deal with when we talk about empathy. One is that it's a skill and it's something that we can learn. But I think for the most part, empathy comes from the overflow of what we have inside of us. And I know that if I have shame inside of me, it's very hard for me to connect, and it's very hard for me to be empathetic. And I walked into my parenting and into my marriage with shame. I didn't know it at the time, but I brought that into my family because of the family of origin that I had. And I'm not going to blame my parents. They did not intentionally put shame on me. And I don't think that I would say that I ever put shame on my son intentionally. But sometimes there's things that we do that are just innate and that are reactive, and we don't even realize that we're doing them. And I think some of the things that I did and some of the interactions that I had with my son were really born out of that place of feeling like I wasn't enough, and that place of shame in my own life. And so understanding this role of shame and how it impacts us, when we feel shame or when we're walking in shame, we kind of put up that hard shell. And that interrupts connection. And so maybe it's something like, son, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this to our family? And we don't mean it to be shameful, but they take it as, I'm bad and I am wrong. And so when we start to heal that shame and change our language, it really can change the dynamic of our family. Empathy really comes out of that place of wounding. We're all wounded. We've all been wounded. And when we understand and come alongside someone who is suffering, we can find that place in ourselves that perhaps was wounded, and we can identify that with that person that was suffering. And that really helps us to evoke compassion as we walk through this with our loved ones. And again, it kind of goes back to understanding the disease. And that is that my son is not bad. He is just not well. And so when he is suffering, I can evoke empathy for his suffering because I understand suffering. It's not the same as his. It's not going to look exactly the same. But I can come alongside of him and I can say, I don't understand, but I am sorry. And those three words are three of the most powerful words that we've incorporated into our family healing. I am so sorry. And it works with our loved ones regardless of where they're at in the stages of change. We can implement those words and that empathy even in the pre-contemplation ambivalent stage of their journey. They might come to you and they might say, I lost my phone again. And we have two choices when we interact with them at that moment. And one choice is to kind of drive the knife in the wound and say, well, you know what, if you weren't using, you wouldn't have lost your phone. And I'm ashamed to say, honestly, that I've made those comments. And that could be one choice. But the empathetic choice would be simply to just say, I'm so sorry. Later on in the stages of change, as they get into active recovery, they're going to struggle. They're going to have a really hard time. And we can't understand it if we've never been in active addiction. But we can come alongside of them from that place of suffering and that place of wounding in us. And we can say, I am so sorry that you're suffering. Coming beside people in empathy and compassion is critical to whole family healing. I see this as I interact with my children, and I see this as I interact with my husband. And mostly I see it as I interact with the other families that I walk alongside day in and day out that are also suffering in this disease. 3 simple words, I'm so sorry, can greatly impact and heal your family. The next area I want to talk about is the power of intentionality. Now, I do believe that is a word, but if it isn't, I'm going to make it up anyway. The power of being intentional. I remember when I first started on this journey, I was told that I was powerless. And I didn't want to accept that. I did not believe that I didn't have any power. Now, granted, I will say that we are powerless over other people's actions, over other people's choices, over how the disease affects people. But I am not powerless. And every day in my power, I can make choices. But I can't make choices unless I'm intentional about that. I was the classic overreactor. And what I realized is that as my son's disease progressed, I was really triggered because of what had gone on in my own family of origin. If my son yelled at me, I yelled louder. If he yelled louder, I yelled louder still. I was rough and gruff and harsh. Words flew out of my mouth, and I'm not proud of those words that came out of my mouth. And I learned through therapy the power of being mindful. And I really talk about it as being balanced. I think there's extremes as we deal with this. And some people are on one extreme, which they're burying their head in the sand, and they don't want to deal with what's going on, and they hide from it. And then there are people like I was, which are super confrontational and very reactive, and just want to get in there and face it head on. And what I learned was neither extreme was good in our family. And I had to understand how to find my center and find my balance so that I could be mindful in the disease and how the disease was affecting my family. Now that can look different for different people. My recommendation would be when you're done with this, that you go take a piece of paper and write down some things that really help you become more balanced and centered. And that may look like I'm gonna take a break and I'm gonna go take a walk. That may look like I'm gonna go take a bubble bath. I'm gonna go get some exercise. I'm gonna listen to my favorite music. I'm gonna read a book. Or I'm just gonna step back and I'm gonna choose to not do anything right now. Some people call that practicing the pause. And there's a really awesome quote that I just love. And it says, there is a space between what's currently happening and our reaction to what's happening, and that is our power. And I realized that my power in this is how I react to it, how I interact with it, and the choices that I make. And I can't do that if I'm not in a mindful place. The other piece of intentionality is what I call practicing radical acceptance. And for me, that looks like not living in the past and living in the what could have been or what was or what should have been. Nor does it mean looking too far into the future, but just being present in the moment and appreciating the little moments that come up and that occur. And I think this is really important in the disease, because what I realized as I went on this journey was that my son really could die. And I wanted to know that if that happened, that the interactions that I had with him were coming out of love and were loving and intentional. I wanted to know that if these were the last words that I said to him, that he would know that he was loved. Or if this text was the last text that I sent to him, that he would know that it was love. Because we're never guaranteed a single moment. And that to me is practicing loving well, which is if the worst case scenario happened, would I be okay and would I be at peace with how I've interacted with my son? And that doesn't mean that I sit back and do nothing. That doesn't mean that I don't attempt to intervene or to help my son with recovery. But it does mean that I operate out of a place of love and intentionality and choice. And again, that's where I really find my power. The last thing I want to address, or the fourth core value, is the power of our words. I knew in the disease that I was speaking words of death over my son, that I was not speaking words of life. I didn't really know how to correct it, but my language was definitely shaming language. And as I went through this process and learned more about the power of our words, I realized that really what I was doing was shitting all over my son. And that only led to additional shame. Well, if you only did this, or you need to do that, or you should do this. And there's nothing probably more ineffective with someone who's ambivalent or oppositional than telling them what they need to do or what they should do. It was challenging because my son was a minor and I really felt that it was my job to direct him. And that it was my job and my right as a parent to tell him what he needed to do. And what it did was it compounded the shame and drove us farther and farther apart in our relationship. So I love the techniques of motivational interviewing. And some of these come right out of that. And the first one is that we have the power to affirm our loved one. And we can affirm them in any stage of change. And I know this can be really difficult. Sometimes it's really hard to find the good. And I remember feeling so desperate about my son and his situation, like, I don't even like him. How can I find anything to affirm in him? And one of the things that was really helpful, and one of the things we do in our group and when I coach families, is I have them take a piece of paper and write down all of the wonderful good qualities that you believe about your loved one, all of the things that you know to be true about them, and certainly that were true before they were in their disease. For us, those were things like, my son was so alive. He was extreme, and we loved that about him. He was engaging, and he was charismatic. He was athletic. He was a hard worker. And there were all these qualities and characteristics that were true about him. And so I had to find a way to begin to speak that over his life. And I really believe that what we put out there verbally comes back to us. And I believe that what we say can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. I remember when I was young, I had eye problems. And I would run into things. I remember tipping over milk cartons. I remember sitting on things and breaking them because I didn't see them. And I was labeled as clumsy. And I still wear that label. I still feel like I'm clumsy. And at times I will say something like, oh, I'm such a klutz. And that was something that was spoken over me and that I have bought into for over 50 years. What we speak over our loved one is so powerful. And so I'm going to put out there words that heal. And I have learned through this process that the fewer words that I use, the better it is too. I think part of healing our family is listening well and not talking too much. And so we want to use our words judiciously, and we want to use our affirmations sparingly, in the sense that we don't want to gloat and we don't want to be disingenuine about the words that we say. But I'll give you an example. I have a daughter who has also suffered from some mental health issues, and she's in recovery as well. And she would come to me and she would want to verbally vent about a situation with her friends. And in the past, what I would have done was tried to solve that problem for her. And I might have even dug the knife in just a little bit. Well, your problem is that you're not a good friend. Or your problem is that, you're too self-centered or talking too much, or whatever it may be. So the new me has had the opportunity to learn and grow and change. And so my daughter will come in and she wants to vent about a friend. And the first thing I do is I stop and I put down my phone and I put down my computer and I look her in the eyes and I listen. And I just listen. And after a while, in that particular situation, regardless of how I feel she's behaving, I can say to her, what I love about you is that you are a really loyal friend. So another scenario, my son's in active addiction. He gets booted out from the house he was in because he stole. He was using. He called me on the phone. And he said, I am so angry. You wouldn't believe what just happened. I just got kicked out of my house for stealing. I swear to you, I did not steal. Now, at that point, I could have said to him, well, you know what? If you wouldn't have been using, you wouldn't have gotten kicked out. And I hear families using that language all the time. Well, if you would just stop using, these things wouldn't happen. And that's counterproductive when it comes to healing families. So I stopped, I kind of practiced that pause. I got in a mindful place and I said, Sana, I am so sorry. You know, one of the things that I know about you is that you're very resourceful. I'm confident you're going to be able to figure this out. And I just affirmed the fact that he was resourceful and that he was a hard worker. I didn't solve his problem for him. I didn't dig the knife in. I just told him I thought he was capable of figuring it out. The other skill that we can use with our words is reflective listening to de-escalate a hot situation. And this is extraordinarily effective when someone comes in and they're angry and they're volatile and they're coming at you. And you can look at them and you can say, I'm so sorry. What I hear is that you're extremely frustrated right now. Or it seems like you're really angry at your friend. Or I can tell this is really frustrating for you. And so you're listening to what they're saying and you're reflecting the words that they're speaking to you. And what that conveys to them is that you really do care and that you really are listening. I have physically seen the change in someone using reflective statements to de-escalate a situation. My son called and said, oh my gosh, I have $300 missing from my checking account. And my response was, I am so sorry. I can tell you are extremely frustrated, and that would be very frustrating. Again, I didn't accuse him, and I didn't try to solve his problem for him. All I did was acknowledge his feelings and his emotions in that situation. The last piece of the power of our words is empowering them to make choices. And that's through using open-ended questioning. Using questioning to help them discover for themselves what their next actionable solution is, empowers the whole family, it heals the whole family. It takes the pressure off of us to solve their problems, and it helps them to feel like they have the power to make their own choices and solve their own problems. An example of that, and I'm just going to be really real and vulnerable right now, was just last Sunday. My husband and I did a intervention with our son. And we were talking to him about how his using was impacting us, and he started crying. And at that point, there were a number of things that either one of us could have said. And we stopped, and I looked at him and I said, tell me about those tears. And because I asked that one question, he really shared some very deep, insightful things about how he felt about his disease and getting sober. And it was facilitated by one simple question. Tell me about those tears. Especially as they move towards recovery, it's so important to help them to determine for themselves what their recovery looks like and how they should walk through this. And we can do this by asking effective, open-ended questions. You know, Mom, I'm not sure if I should go to this sober house or this sober house. What do you think I should do? Okay, son, what do you think the pros and cons are? Let's talk about sober house number 1. What are the pros and cons of that house? Let's talk about sober house number 2. What are the pros and cons? And so we can help them to discover what they think is best for themselves. And when we do that and we step back, boy, I tell you, it really facilitates them moving forward in their own recovery. If they're coming back home, what would you like your recovery to look like? What do you think will be effective for you? What are some sober supports that you can put in place so that you feel safe? So there's a whole slew of questions that we can ask as part of listening well that allow us to form those connections. Connections come when we listen, when we reflect, when we affirm, and all of those things really heal families. As we finish up here, I have just a couple of final thoughts. When we implement these strategies, when we develop these core beliefs, when we practice things like being mindful and radical acceptance, and we're in relationship with our loved one, it really frees us to be able to lovingly, compassionately set boundaries. And I want to make sure that we're clear here that love and compassion and those things that drive us are never a reason to not set boundaries. And it actually frees us up to really love well when we are boundaried. And just a word on that, boundaries are safety fences for us. They're not a means to manipulate. They're not a means to control. Boundaries are really about relationship. And so it is in the relationship and in the connection that we can compassionately set those boundaries. And oftentimes when we have that relationship, then people honor and respect those boundaries. And the other thing that it isn't a license to do is to overhelp our children. Even though they are in a disease, they do have the power of choice at times in that disease. And when we overhelp them or over-rescue them, we're really only helping them stay in their disease. So when I talk about empowering, we're going to empower recovery. We're going to empower all the things that would lead to them moving into a place of recovery. So one of the things I love to say and paint a picture about is a boulder. And there are times, even with my sober kids, where they are capable of carrying the boulder on their shoulders. And then there are other times when I need to help them carry that boulder, or their dad needs to help them carry that boulder. And I often use that to gauge how I'm going to interact with my son who suffers. If he was sober, or just knowing his capabilities, should this be a boulder that he should be able to carry? And sometimes when he's in his disease and he wants help, I'll guide him through that. I'll pick up the phone with him and maybe do a 3-way call. I'll give him direction if he needs it, and then give him the opportunity to carry that boulder. So even thinking of them in terms of their disease, there are still things that they can do. There is still strength that they have within them. And our role as family is truly to empower them to step up and do those things. And I just want to finish up here with one final last thought. I have this cup, and this cup says grateful on it. And I don't know that 6 years ago or 7 years ago, I would have been able to look at anyone and say, I'm grateful. And gratitude has been something that has helped me get through some of the most difficult times. And I do have to say that I am grateful for this journey. I'm grateful for the brokenness. I'm grateful for the things that I've learned. And I'm grateful for the hope that I have. And the changes that I've been able to make as a result of how a use disorder has impacted our family. And that's really my hope for you today as we leave this time that we've been able to spend together. My hope is that in the journey, in the healing, that you can find gratitude, and that more than anything else, at the end of this, that you will know that you are enough. Thanks for joining me today. And my hope and prayer is that you can continue on with this journey and that you can continue your healing process. Thank you.